I've gushed enough about indie games on this channel that I should probably talk about my top 10 favorite indie games ever. Putting this list together is one of the hardest things I've ever done because these games vary wildly and honestly don't make for apples to apples style comparisons. So keep in mind that the further I get into this list, the harder it was for me to choose the order of these games. Oh, and there are plenty of indie titles that I haven't played yet, so I'm not going to put them on here. One day I'll play it, damn it, one day. Let's get one thing straight about Papo Yo. Yes, this is not a very good game at a raw mechanical level. The puzzle designs are simplistic, the game frequently has frame rate drops that mar the game's atmosphere, and there are some glitches I encountered that literally sent my character falling through the map like Arno in Assassin's Creed Unity. But I'd be damned if I didn't mention how much of an impact this game left on me. This autobiographical game from Vander Caballero, a man who worked mostly as an art director for EA's FIFA games, is a deeply moving portrait of alcoholism and its effects. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the game's finale is hands down one of the most memorable things I've ever witnessed in any game I've ever played. It's a shame that the gameplay isn't up to snuff with its allegory, but I still feel like this game is worth playing and knowing. It might be surprising to see a mobile game on this list, but Monument Valley is one of the most meticulously gorgeous and well-designed games I've ever played on any platform. It just so happens that this is a game built around a touchscreen. While its story isn't particularly deep, the game has more style in its visuals and sound than almost any game I've played on mobile. On top of that, the game's mind-bending MC Escher graphics evoke a sort of Echochrome feel, if Echochrome was suddenly placed inside the same universe as Shadow of the Colossus. If you have a long plane flight and you're looking for a beautiful way to distract yourself from flying coach, Monument Valley is a hell of a way to do that. Oh, and play this game with headphones. The sound design and music is absolutely gorgeous. Ever since I was a kid, I've had a primal fear of black and white. So imagine how I felt in 2010 when a spider lunged after me out of the darkness of Limbo's world. This game has always evoked a visceral response from me, and it's because Limbo's atmosphere is one of the most gorgeously bleak nightmares I've ever set eyes on. It also helps that Limbo's brutal puzzle designs are actually quite clever, and feature some genuinely great uses of physics-based platforming. Oh, and that ending.
The dead ain't gotta worry about this mess.
Bastion would earn a spot on this list for Logan Cunningham's performance as the game's narrator alone. It earns a higher spot on the list for having a painterly art style, a gripping story, and a combat system that encourages experimentation. Bastion's greatest trait does lie in its narrator, not just the fact that Cunningham's performance is one of the best in the business, but because of the way the game incorporates the narration. The narration interacts with nearly every single decision the player makes, from choosing what to build in your home base, to even when you accidentally fall off of the edge of the world. Oh, and while on the topic of Supergiant Games, the studio behind Bastion, I do want to give a shout out to the excellent game Transistor that's an honorable mention on this list. It would have landed a spot on this list if its story wasn't kind of a complete mess, but I want to highlight the fact that it has one of my all-time favorite combat systems in any RPG. Check it out. But check out Bastion first. Bastion is better. Flower is a beautiful game. That's kind of the start and the end of the discussion to be had about Flower, but the beauty of its world is staggering. Vincent Diamante's musical score in particular does wonders for the game, interacting with the player's every bloom. Yes, there's more to this game in terms of its themes and the broad strokes, but it really is an example of how beautiful a video game can be. I know that's not much of an argument, but I still return to this game's final level just to see something incredible from time to time. It's a game I've never let go of and probably never will. Okay, let's get something out of the way. Yes, Phil Fish is a divisive figure, but he also made one of the most clever platformers I've ever played, so I don't know if I care that people think he's temperamental at times. Fez is a brilliantly designed game with some of the best pixel art in the indie space, but what truly sets Fez apart is how cryptic it manages to be for players who want to go one step farther. Like a lot of games on this list, I don't want to say too much about its surprises, but rest assured that Fez's legendary reputation is well earned. And after speaking briefly about Fez, I'm going to talk forever about the Swapper. What is the Swapper? Probably one of the most underrated indie games I've ever played. I cannot emphasize how criminal it is that the Swapper doesn't come up more in conversations on video game storytelling. It's one of the best stories in the medium for a very simple reason. The story and the mechanic are completely connected. Let me explain something about video game storytelling. I have a personal belief that if you're telling a story in a game, the mechanics of that game should reflect something from that story. A good example of this is a game like BioShock. In essence, it's a story of desperate survival, so you scrounge for bullets and resources in equal measure. Also, the plasmids, Eve, and Adam are more than mechanics in the game. They're an integral part of the story that explains the fall of Rapture, further tying the mechanics to the story. Back to the Swapper. The developers of the Swapper could have easily made a game without a story that would have been reasonably fun to play. The game is a puzzle platformer where you can project up to 3 clones of yourself to place around any given puzzle. Additionally, you can swap between these bodies. There are additional obstacles in the puzzles that are introduced over time, such as lights that prevent you from swapping bodies, and so on. If there's something that seems kind of eerie about that premise, you're not alone. The Swapper's entire sci-fi story is wrapped around the idea of consciousness. If you can swap between bodies and create clones of yourself, who is the original mind? If a clone dies during a puzzle, which happens often, does that clone experience fear in its final moments? Does it feel pain? The Swapper is very interested in these questions and doesn't shy away from the horror inherent to the premise. It helps that the Swapper's puzzles are genuinely clever, but what makes it an all-timer is its extremely compelling story. Look, I've written 4 paragraphs of script about this game, so can you guys play it? So I know that there are people in the world who can appreciate how great this game is? Please? Disclaimer. Castle Crashers is not fun to play by yourself. I'd even go as far as saying that playing this game by yourself is a miserable experience. However, if you add even one more player to the mix, Castle Crashers becomes a really fun piece of work. If you have 4 players, well, need I say more? I have played through Castle Crashers from start to finish multiple times with 4 players, and it's literally the most fun I've ever had with a multiplayer experience. The Behemoth's art combined with the soundtrack ripped from Newgrounds make this one of the definitive indie titles of the last generation, and an all-time couch co-op game. I bought a code for Hotline Miami off of Amazon for the PS3 for $2.49. And since Hotline Miami was on the Sony crossplay list and I imported it to my PS4, it's the best $2.49 I've ever spent in my life. I'm not that great at video games and don't usually have the patience to try and master them, so it should speak volumes about Hotline Miami that it occupies the 2nd slot on this list. Hotline Miami's brutal design is airtight and, for the lack of better language, does not fuck around. One hit, you're dead. It applies to most of the enemies of the game, and you. You only get a checkpoint when you clear a floor of a building. Even if there's only one enemy on the floor and they kill you, you restart. The fact that the game literally doesn't have load times to restart means that you're constantly back into the action, a feature that's crucial to keeping the game's pace moving. And then there's the cryptic story of Hotline Miami, set across multiple timelines as you dive deeper and deeper into the madness. This cryptic story is anchored by some of the most stylish pixel art graphics in the business, and literally one of my favorite soundtracks ever. And when I say favorite ever, that's including film soundtracks as well. It's a tour de force of brutal mania soaked in neon and blood, and an instant classic. The game's sequel is somewhat worth checking out, but it fails to recapture the magic of the original. That being said, if you don't play Hotline Miami 2, listen to the soundtrack. Seriously, if you never played the Hotline Miami games, please listen to the soundtracks for both of them. They're both back-to-back some of the best curated soundtracks in video games and stand on their own merits beyond the games themselves. If Flower was just a beautiful visceral experience to play through, then Journey is something more. Journey has some of the best art direction of any game I've ever played, including the AAA space. It has one of the best orchestral soundtracks of any game I've ever played, including the AAA space. But what truly sets Journey apart is its deeply personal connections that it can create. The game's unique co-op doesn't allow for direct communication between players. The only communication is through a single button press that releases a sound. You can choose to ignore other players, or you can stick together as you move from one area to the next. What happens between you and this anonymous player will probably determine your feelings about this game as a whole. For me, I've never forgotten my first playthrough of Journey. The final segment of that game has been burned into my brain for years as something truly beautiful and touching. That game company has created 3 games over the years: Flow, Flower, and Journey. And the release of Journey almost seemed like an emotional iteration of their previous work. They finally found a way to make the beauty of their games matter at a deeper level, and the end result was one of the most breathtaking experiences I've had in the medium. If it seems like I'm being vague about Journey, it's because I don't want to give away its best surprises for those who haven't played it. Journey is something you have to experience for yourself. In my experience, it's easily my favorite indie game of all time.